April 1945. A small German town, still intact, still quiet enough to hear footsteps on cobblestone. The children notice the sound before anything else. A low vibration, not thunder, not aircraft, something heavier, closer. Windows begin to rattle. Cups tremble on kitchen tables. From cellar stairs and doorways, children lean forward, unsure whether to hide or look. Then the sound becomes unmistakable, metal tracks biting into stone, engines idling with controlled force. The first American tank appears at the end of the street. It does not rush. It moves steadily, deliberately, its turret scanning, its radio antenna swaying with motion. Another follows, then another. They come from different directions, filling intersections, blocking roads, appearing where no one expected them minutes earlier. For children raised on air raid sirens and distant explosions, this is different. The war is no longer overhead. It is eye level, massive, physical, everywhere at once. Some children stare in silence. Others retreat instinctively, pulled back by adults who no longer shout warnings, only instructions. The tanks keep moving, past schools, past homes, past places once familiar. This moment, when American armor seemed to surround entire towns, did not happen by chance. It was the result of a war that had already been decided far beyond this street. And to understand why these tanks appeared everywhere, we must step back to see how Germany reached this final spring. By the winter of 1944, the war inside Germany was no longer a distant front. It was approaching from every direction, carried by exhausted soldiers, broken rail lines, and the steady retreat of armies that could no longer hold ground. In the West, Allied forces had broken out of Normandy months earlier. France had fallen. Belgium followed. The failed German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, the last large-scale attempt to reverse the war, had consumed irreplaceable reserves of fuel, armor, and trained manpower. When it ended in January 1945, Germany's western defenses were hollowed out. The Rhine River, long described by Nazi propaganda as an unbreakable barrier, was now the final obstacle between American armies and the German heartland. Bridges were prepared for demolition. Civil defense units rehearsed evacuations that no longer made sense. Children in schools were taught how to dig shallow trenches and recognize Allied aircraft silhouettes, even as classrooms emptied from fear and hunger. Inside German cities and towns, daily life narrowed. Coal shortages left homes unheeded. Food rations were cut again. Fathers were absent, dead, captured, or assigned to Volkssturm units made up of teenagers and elderly men. For children, the war was defined by waiting. Waiting for sirens, waiting for news, waiting for something to change. At the same time, American industrial power was peaking. By early 1945, the United States had deployed thousands of medium and heavy tanks across Europe. Sherman variants, M26 Pershings, armored recovery vehicles, and self-propelled artillery. These were supported by unmatched logistics. Fuel moved forward continuously. Spare parts arrived on schedule. Damaged vehicles were repaired or replaced within days. This meant that when American units advanced, they did not advance in narrow columns. They spread. Armor appeared on side roads, in villages, behind hills that German defenders assumed were safe. The doctrine emphasized mobility, speed, and constant pressure. For German civilians, especially children, this created a new reality. Tanks no longer meant a single frontline encounter. They meant presence, persistent, unavoidable, and everywhere. By March 1945, that presence crossed the Rhine. And once it did, the experience of the war changed completely for those watching from their doorways. The crossing of the Rhine did not produce the climactic stand that German planners had promised for years. Instead, it marked the collapse of the idea of a front line itself. On March 7, 1945, American forces captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen intact. Within hours, U.S. infantry crossed. Within days, armor followed. Pontoon bridges were thrown across the river at multiple points, faster than German command could respond. By the end of March, entire American armored divisions were operating east of the Rhine. For German civilians, the war no longer moved in lines. It moved in pockets, columns, and sudden appearances. American armored units advanced using multiple routes simultaneously. Rather than concentrating tanks only on main highways, commanders pushed armor along secondary roads, farm paths, and rail corridors. Villages that had not heard artillery fire suddenly heard engine noise. Fields that had never seen soldiers became temporary bivouacs. Children noticed this first. They saw tanks parked beside schoolyards, tracks cutting across orchards, soldiers washing helmets in streams, vehicles refueling calmly in open squares where German troops had once marched in rigid formation. The scale was unfamiliar. There were too many vehicles, too much fuel, too much movement. German propaganda had taught that Allied armor was fragile, dependent, vulnerable. What children observed contradicted this daily. Destroyed tanks were rare. Breakdowns were temporary. When a vehicle stopped, another replaced it. When one column passed, another followed hours later. This was not how German armor had operated by 1945. The Wehrmacht, starved of fuel and spare parts, had learned to hide its remaining tanks. They were kept under camouflage nets, moved only at night, committed sparingly. Children had grown accustomed to absence, to seeing no armor at all, even as the war raged. American tanks were the opposite. They were visible, confident, repetitive. In towns across western and central Germany, children began to recognize American vehicle silhouettes before adults did. The rounded turret of the Sherman, the white tracks, the white stars painted openly on hulls. These machines did not retreat after brief contact. They stayed. By April, the Ruhr pocket was encircled. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers surrendered. Resistance became localized and uneven. In many areas, no German units remained at all, only civilians waiting to learn who now controlled the roads. For children, this was the most disorienting moment of the war. The tanks did not arrive once. They arrived again and again. The idea that American armor was everywhere was not exaggeration. It was the visible result of total logistical dominance, applied relentlessly across a collapsing nation. And it was from this civilian perspective, especially the youngest, that the meaning of American tanks became something more than military power. It became proof that the war, as they had known it, was over. Angle 1. The child's view of occupation armor. For German children in the spring of 1945, tanks were no longer symbols from posters or distant newsreels. They were physical objects that altered daily life. A tank blocked the road to school. A tank idled beside the bakery. A tank slept overnight in the field where games had once been played. Children did not understand strategy, but they understood permanence. American tanks did not pass through and vanish. They stayed long enough to be counted, touched, avoided. Tracks remained in the mud. Oil stains marked cobblestones. Canvas tarps flapped in the wind for days. This was unfamiliar. German armor, when it appeared late in the war, was brief and tense. Vehicles moved quickly, often damaged, often hidden. Adults whispered. Children were told to stay inside. American tanks arrived differently. They came in daylight. Crews sat on turrets. Engines ran without urgency. For children raised on warnings about Allied brutality, this created cognitive confusion. These machines were supposed to destroy, not linger. Yet they lingered. Some children watched from doorways as American tank crews cooked meals beside their vehicles. Others saw soldiers distributing rations to civilians. The presence of armor no longer meant immediate danger. It meant control. This did not remove fear. It changed its shape. Children learned new rules quickly. Where to stand. Where not to run. Which gestures drew attention. The tank became a fixed object in their mental map of the village, like a church or bridge. And with that normalization came recognition. The war's most powerful machines now belonged to someone else. That realization carried into the next layer of experience, the military reality behind the steel. Angle 2, American armor doctrine in the final push. American tanks appeared everywhere because they were designed to operate that way. By 1945, U.S. armor doctrine emphasized speed, redundancy, and constant pressure. The M4 Sherman was not the heaviest tank on the battlefield, but it was reliable, reparable, and available in enormous numbers. More importantly, it was never meant to operate alone. Shermans moved with infantry, engineers, reconnaissance units, and logistics trucks in coordinated columns. When resistance appeared, tanks did not halt the advance everywhere. They bypassed, isolated, and continued forward. This created the illusion of omnipresence. German defenses, already fractured, could not respond to simultaneous pressure across dozens of points. Fuel shortages meant counterattacks were rare and brief. When they failed, American armor did not withdraw. It expanded. Children observed this expansion without understanding it. Roads once empty now carried traffic day and night. Columns overlapped. New tanks arrived before old ones departed. This was not accidental. It was the visible expression of industrial warfare applied at scale. And that scale carried psychological weight. Not just for soldiers, but for those watching silently from behind shattered windows. That psychological dimension, shaped by memory and expectation, defined the enemy's experience as well, and it deepened as the armored presence continued. Angle 3. The enemy perspective, collapse seen through steel. For German civilians, especially children, American tanks did not arrive as a single event. They accumulated. One day there were 3. The next, 6. Then entire streets were lined with armored vehicles bearing white stars. To adults, this signaled something final. To children, it felt unreal. The war they had been told would be defended street by street was instead dissolving in front of them. There were no counterattacks. No dramatic reversals. German soldiers appeared briefly, then disappeared. The absence was as striking as the presence. Children noticed that the tanks were not cautious in the way German vehicles had been. They did not hide behind buildings or trees. They parked openly. This communicated a message without words. Resistance was no longer expected. Enemy power was no longer something spoken about in whispers. It was parked outside. This visibility mattered. Fear thrives on uncertainty. The American armored presence replaced uncertainty with inevitability. The tanks were not searching for enemies. They were organizing space. For a generation raised on promises of endurance, this was disorienting. The enemy was not advancing with desperation. It was settling in. That shift, away from battle and toward control, reshaped how the war ended at ground level. Angle 4. Logistics, why the tanks never seemed to stop. American tanks appeared everywhere because they were never alone for long. Behind each armored column stretched a supply system unmatched in scale. Fuel trucks followed closely. Maintenance crews repaired vehicles on the roadside. Damaged tanks were recovered, not abandoned. Replacement parts arrived within hours or days. German children noticed this without understanding it. A tank that broke down in the morning was moving again by evening. A vehicle damaged yesterday was replaced today. Nothing stayed broken for long. This constancy contrasted sharply with German equipment. Late-war German vehicles often remained immobile for days, stripped for parts, or destroyed by their own crews due to fuel shortages. American logistics erased pauses. This mattered psychologically. The presence of tanks was continuous. There were no gaps for hope to grow, no signs of exhaustion. From a military standpoint, this was the decisive advantage of the U.S. Army in 1945. Not superior armor alone, but uninterrupted movement. And uninterrupted movement meant the war did not return once it passed. It stayed finished. Angle 5. Children and the rewriting of fear. Fear does not disappear. It adapts. For German children, tanks were once symbols of protection, featured in schoolbooks and parades. By 1945, they had become symbols of survival through compliance. Children learned quickly that American tanks were not triggered by noise or curiosity. They were dangerous only when challenged. Silence, distance, and stillness were enough. This lesson replaced older instincts. Some children later recalled touching tank tracks after crews left, measuring their hands against the steel. Others remembered watching soldiers clean weapons calmly, without urgency. These details mattered. They contradicted years of conditioning. Fear shifted from anticipation of violence to acceptance of control. And in that shift, the war's emotional conclusion took shape. Not in explosions, but in routine. And once that transition occurred, there was no path backward. The psychological effect was immediate. When tanks remain stationary by choice, not necessity, resistance becomes unthinkable. Children sensed this before adults articulated it. The tanks were no longer passing through. They were staying. And with that realization, Germany's war ended at ground level, long before official documents confirmed it. But the full meaning of this shift would only become clear as the days passed, and the armor settled into permanence. The moment control became irreversible. As April moved toward its end, American armored units stopped advancing not because they were blocked, but because there was nowhere left to push without orders. For German children, this was the clearest signal that the war had crossed a final threshold. Tanks remained parked in the same places day after day. Crews rotated shifts. Guards were posted, then relaxed. Soldiers washed, shaved, wrote letters. The machinery of occupation replaced the machinery of battle. No German counterattacks came. This absence was decisive. In earlier years of the war, quiet often preceded violence. In 1945, quiet followed it. The American tanks were not waiting for a fight. They were administering an outcome already decided. Children noticed patterns. Tanks arrived with markings carefully repainted. White stars were refreshed. Vehicles were numbered and logged. Nothing suggested improvisation. Everything suggested permanence. Local authority collapsed visibly. German police no longer directed traffic. American military police did. Signs were posted in multiple languages. Curfews were enforced calmly, consistently. This order contrasted sharply with the chaos of the preceding months. The presence of tanks everywhere was no longer threatening because it was predictable. Predictability replaced fear. For German civilians, especially the young, this marked the true end of the war. Not surrender announcements or speeches, but the realization that nothing was going to change tomorrow. The same tanks would be there. The same soldiers. The same rules. And because American armor had arrived simultaneously across wide regions, there was no alternative space left. No pocket where the old war still lived. The turning point was not a battle. It was acceptance. Acceptance that resistance had no future. Acceptance that the occupying force was organized, supplied, and staying. Acceptance that survival now depended on adaptation, not defiance. This was the quiet climax of the war for millions of civilians. And once that moment passed, the story shifted from conquest to consequence. In the weeks following the collapse of resistance, American tanks remained a constant feature of daily life across large parts of Germany. For children, this presence reshaped routines. Routes to school changed. Play areas shrank or shifted. Streets once used freely became monitored spaces. Tanks did not move often, but their weight was felt everywhere. In blocked sightlines, restricted crossings, altered habits. Yet violence did not follow. Occupation policy prioritized order. American armored units supported military government teams tasked with stabilizing towns, preventing looting, and restoring basic services. Tanks were positioned not for combat, but deterrence. Children observed soldiers directing traffic, guarding warehouses, and escorting supply convoys. These actions contrasted sharply with wartime imagery they had been taught. The tanks did not fire. They enforced quiet. Food distribution became visible. Ration points reopened under supervision. Trucks arrived regularly. While shortages remained severe, the immediate chaos of the final war months eased. This mattered profoundly to families. For children who had lived under constant disruption, the stillness beneath armored watch felt unnatural at first. But it became familiar. The tanks no longer symbolized danger. They symbolized boundaries. And boundaries, once understood, allowed life to resume. This transformation did not imply approval or gratitude. It implied survival. Civilians adjusted because adjustment was necessary. The American armored presence did not erase trauma, but it ended unpredictability. And with unpredictability gone, the war's human cost entered a new phase, one measured not in explosions, but but in adaptation. That adaptation would define the occupation years to come. Numbers, reality, and the weight of defeat. By May 1945, the scale of American armored dominance across Germany was unmistakable. U.S. forces had deployed thousands of tanks and armored vehicles across multiple army groups. Entire regions were under continuous Allied control. German armored units, once central to the nation's military identity, had ceased to exist as organized formations. For civilians, especially children, this collapse was not abstract. They counted tanks. They recognized insignia. They learned which roads belonged to whom. Occupation reports from the period described rapid stabilization in areas secured by armored divisions. Violence decreased sharply once resistance ended. Civilian casualties declined. Infrastructure repairs began almost immediately where fighting had ceased. The psychological weight of defeat settled unevenly. Adults struggled with shame, fear, and uncertainty. Children processed the outcome differently. For them, the presence of American tanks marked the boundary between danger and survival. Medical and social observers noted that children adapted faster than adults to occupation conditions. Routines returned. Schools reopened where possible. Children learned new rules without ideological framing. This adaptability mattered. It allowed a generation to move forward without constant terror. The war became something that had happened, not something that was still happening. American tanks, by their sheer ubiquity, enforced this transition. They prevented the reemergence of chaos. They eliminated ambiguity. The war did not fade out gradually. It stopped. And once it stopped, memory began its work, shaping how the experience would be recalled, interpreted, and taught. That process of memory, layered and incomplete, would define how this moment was understood decades later.